Dust rolled up from the prairie road, glowing gold in the sinking light of evening. Clara May Hollister walked with her head bent low, bare feet bruised from the gravel, her dress hem dark with dust and the miles behind her. Beside her trudged Annie, only 8, her small jaw set in a kind of fragile determination no child should carry. The littlest one, Ruth, dangled against Clara's hip until Clara's strength gave out, and Annie, though too small for the burden, tried to help carry her. The wind tugged at their hair. Hunger had stripped the glow from their cheeks, and yet Annie whispered in a way that broke the silence like a prayer, "Mama, maybe someone will help us this time." They reached the edges of town just as lamps were being lit behind windows. But the faces inside turned away. A woman sweeping her porch stiffened and hurried inside when she recognized them. A shopkeeper slammed his shutters as though their hunger was contagious. Clara felt the sting of whispers trailing after her. Martha Picken's sharp tongue leading the pack. That widow's cursed. Husband gone, no land, nothing but mouths to feed. Misery clings to her like dust. Clara tightened her grip on Annie's hand and pushed on. At the mercantile, she drew her last possession from a hidden pocket, a silver locket that once belonged to her mother. She held it out with trembling fingers, begging for bread. The shopkeeper shook his head. "A trinket won't feed you. We've mouths of our own." He turned the lock and drew down the shade, leaving her in the street with the girls. Annie's eyes flickered, not with tears, but with a child's dawning understanding of how cruel the world could be. Clara's arms were aching when she finally set Ruth down. The little one's forehead burned with fever. Annie, seeing the panic in her mother's eyes, gathered her courage and led Ruth to the sheriff's office. Boone Calloway met them at the door, hat in hand, weary from the weight of a town that refused compassion. "I wish I could help," he said softly, "but the people here won't take kindly to me sheltering you." Annie looked up at him, her voice small and trembling, and asked words no child should ever think of. "Can you take her instead of me? Mama's tired, and Ruth's too little. I can walk alone." Boone had no answer. His throat closed, and he looked away. From the shadowed doorway of the saloon, another figure had been watching. Silas McKenna stood silent, hat brim casting his eyes in shade. Tall, broad from years of ranch work, but with a quietness about him like a man carrying sorrow that never leaves. He did not step forward. He did not speak, only watched as Clara gathered her daughters and turned from the sheriff's office, humiliation burning her cheeks. Whispers rippled through the street. "That's McKenna, the widower. Doesn't talk much since his wife died. Keeps to himself." Clara pulled her shawl tighter, trying to disappear as she led the girls back toward the edge of town. But as the sky darkened and the road stretched lonely ahead, footsteps fell behind her. Heavy, steady. Then a shadow drew alongside. Silas McKenna stopped in front of her without a word. His hands were rough, scarred from work, but he reached down gently and lifted Ruth into his arms as if she were glass. Clara froze, her breath caught. She had begged and pleaded until her voice was raw. And here came a man who said nothing at all, only carried. He led them to his wagon. Clara's pride flared hot. What would it cost her to accept this mercy? But Annie tugged her sleeve, whispering, "Mama, please." And so Clara climbed up with her eldest while Ruth lay against the rancher's chest. The ride-out was filled with silence. Wheels creaked. The prairie wind whispered low. At one point, Silas passed a canteen to Clara. Their fingers brushed, quick, almost accidental, but it lingered longer in her chest than she expected. He never spoke, but something about his silence felt like shelter. They came to his ranch by moonrise. Wide fields stretched around a lonely house, weathered wood and broken fences, but solid enough to hold the storms. He carried Ruth inside and laid her in a quilt that still carried the faded scent of a woman long gone. Clara stood by the hearth, shame rising inside her, shame for needing help, for being seen so broken. Annie curled against her side and whispered, "Mama, he ain't turned us away." The storm broke outside that night, rain against the roof. Clara stood staring at the fire when Annie tiptoed across the room toward Silas. Her voice was soft, meant for him alone. "Can you take her instead of me?" She glanced at her mother, asleep in the chair, face hollowed by grief. Annie didn't mean Ruth this time. She meant Mama. She meant, take care of her too. Silas looked at the child for a long, silent beat, then turned his eyes to Clara. His silence weighed heavy, but it was not empty. It was a vow forming, unspoken but sure. He gave one slow nod, and in that nod, a choice was made. He would not take one. He would take them all. Dawn spilled over the prairie in pink and gold. Ruth's fever eased. Clara stirred the fire, helping prepare the morning meal, awkward in a kitchen that was not hers. Silas watched from the porch, quiet as ever, yet something in his eyes softened, almost warmed. Annie played in the yard, her laughter light after days of silence. And so it was, in the quiet mercy of one man's refusal to turn away, a new beginning took root. Not in grand gestures, not in declarations, just in the silent act of carrying what others had cast aside. And if you listening now ever find yourself wandering some lonely road, hungry, tired, unseen, remember this. Sometimes salvation does not arrive with fanfare or words. Sometimes it arrives in the steady silence of someone who simply refuses to leave you behind. There was a stillness in Silas McKenna's ranch house that morning, the kind that seemed to have been waiting years to be broken. The walls carried memories. His wife's quilt draped across the bed where Ruth now slept, her hand-sewn curtains swaying faintly in the prairie breeze. Clara moved slowly through the kitchen, her hands uncertain, as though every movement risked trespassing into someone else's grief. She stirred oats into a pot, and the simple act of cooking for another man felt strange, almost dangerous, as though she were stepping into a place her heart had no right to enter. Silas stood at the doorframe, arms crossed, watching quietly. He didn't offer words, but when Clara's fingers trembled and she almost spilled the oats, he moved forward, steadied the pot, and then stepped back again. No comment, no judgment, only presence. Clara swallowed, cheeks burning. She had been turned away, ridiculed, whispered about by townsfolk who saw her as nothing but a burden, and now, here was a man whose silence didn't wound, but steadied. Annie sat on the porch, humming to herself, her bare feet swinging as she tried to braid her hair the way her mother once did. Ruth's fever had broken, her small breaths even and steady, and the color had returned to her lips. Clara, noticing this, felt her knees weaken. She pressed her hand over her mouth, tears rising for the first time in days, not from despair, but from the unbearable relief of seeing her child safe. Yet shame clung tight to her. She remembered the faces in town, the turning shutters, the cold refusals. Wouldn't the whispers only grow crueler now? Asterisk the widow at McKenna's place. Another woman desperate enough to find her way under his roof. Asterisk. As if sensing the storm in her, Annie climbed into her lap later that afternoon. The girl pressed her forehead against her mother's chest and whispered, "Mama, maybe he's lonely like us." Clara's hand froze in the child's hair. The thought was dangerous, but it lingered. That evening, the sky darkened with thunder. The storm rolled heavy, and, as the first drops began to fall, Clara went outside to pull on the drying clothes Silas had hung earlier. The wind tore at her dress, whipped her hair, and she fumbled with the clothespins until another pair of hands joined hers. Silas moved wordlessly at her side, gathering the clothes with quiet efficiency. When the last sheet was pulled free, a flash of lightning lit his face. The scar across his jaw, the deep lines around his mouth, the eyes that spoke of losses not unlike her own. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to offer some words to fill the silence, but none came. And, somehow, he didn't require them. He carried the heavy pile of damp fabric inside, brushed water from his brow, and lit another lamp as though it were the most natural thing in the world to stand shoulder to shoulder with her. That night, Ruth slept soundly by the hearth. Annie, curled under a quilt, drifted into dreams. Clara sat awake, staring at the fire, her heart torn between gratitude and fear. She knew the town would not forgive her for staying here. She knew whispers traveled faster than the prairie wind. But when she turned her head, she found Silas seated at the far end of the table, sharpening a worn knife by the lantern glow. He glanced up once, and their eyes held in a quiet that spoke louder than voices. "We are both broken, but perhaps not beyond mending." In the days that followed, small acts began to stitch together something like belonging. Silas repaired Ruth's worn shoes with scraps of leather. Clara mended his torn work shirts, her hands shaking at first, then growing steadier with each stitch. Annie helped carry buckets from the well, her laughter carrying across the fields, filling corners of the ranch that had been silent too long. The town took notice. Martha Pickens, sharp as ever, spread her venom at the general store. She's found herself a roof, hasn't she? Some women have a way of latching on. But Sheriff Calloway, overhearing, muttered, better she latch on a kindness than waste away in the street. And though gossip swirled, Silas never spoke of it. His silence, once heavy, became a shield against their scorn. One evening near dusk, Clara found herself lingering at the porch rail, watching Silas return from the fields. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but when he saw Annie running toward him, hair flying, he stopped, crouched down, and lifted her into his arms with surprising gentleness. Clara's throat tightened. She remembered the little girl's words that night by the fire. Asterisk, can you take her instead of me? Asterisk. And she realized Annie had already found her answer. Later, when the stars spilled bright across the sky, Clara stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her face. Silas stood there too, hands tucked into his pockets, looking out over the dark fields. She joined him without a word. For a long time, they simply stood together, silence stretching between them like a bridge. Finally, she whispered, more to the night than to him, I don't know why you chose to help us. He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, in a voice rough from disuse, he said, because someone should have. It was the first time she heard his voice. Clara closed her eyes, and in that moment, something inside her, battered and starved for so long, lifted its head toward hope. When dawn came again, the house was no longer hollow. The smell of bread drifted from the kitchen. Annie's laughter echoed in the yard. Ruth toddled about, her fever gone. Silas sat at the table with a mug of coffee, watching Clara move with ease in a space that had once been barren. He didn't need to declare anything, for the truth was plain. He had not taken one instead of another. He had taken them all, and in doing so, had found himself taken back in a life as well. And so, dear listener, remember this truth carried on prairie winds. Salvation does not always come with shouts or promises. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the steady hand that lifts you when others turn away, in the quiet vow of someone who simply stays. May you know such mercy in your own wandering, and may you, too, be unafraid to give it when the lonely cross your path.